You ever walk into a place that feels like it's already dreaming you? That's how it felt the first night I stepped off that bus. The rain was cold, the air thick, and the whole town just watched. Not with eyes, but with silence. Everyone here moves like they already know what's coming. They don't talk about it. They don't look you in the eye. But when you sleep, they whisper. They whisper your name, your secrets, your ending. And the worst part, they were right. I stepped off the bus onto the slick, rain-soaked stones of the main street. The air biting cold and heavy with mist that coiled around the crooked rooftops like spectral fingers. The town lay cradled in the shadows of the surrounding mountains, their jagged peaks swallowed by low-hanging clouds. A stiff wind whispered through the skeletal branches of leafless trees, carrying with it a scent both earthy and faintly metallic, as if the ground itself bled secrets. I pulled my coat tighter, the fabric damp against my skin, and took my first tentative steps forward. The street was deserted, or so I thought, until a movement caught my eye. A figure emerged from a narrow alley, a woman wrapped in a threadbare shawl, her eyes sharp and wary. She glanced at me briefly before hastening away into the fog, leaving a silence that felt heavier than the mist. The inn loomed ahead, its weathered sign creaking softly in the wind. Inside, the scent of wood smoke mingled with the faint aroma of stale oil. Ellen Royce, the caretaker, met me at the door. Her face was kind but guarded, her eyes flickering with something I couldn't yet name. "You must be the newcomer," she said, voice low, almost a whisper. "We don't get many passing through these days." I nodded, offering a tired smile. Looking for a quiet place to lay low, she studied me a moment, then led me to a small room at the back. The walls were thin, the bed creaked under my weight, and the single window framed the encroaching darkness outside. As night deepened, the town's silence grew oppressive, pierced only by distant, indistinct murmurs that seemed to seep through the walls, wrapping tight around my thoughts. Lying there, the shadows in the corners of the room began to shift, or maybe it was my mind playing tricks. The whispers grew louder, chanting my name in tones both tender and accusing. I closed my eyes, but the darkness inside them was no refuge. Instead, I found myself falling into a nightmare unlike any I'd known. I stood in a void where time felt suspended, enveloped in a thick blackness that swallowed every sound except the persistent, sibilant voices. They spoke of endings and beginnings, of fate sealed and curses binding. I saw flashes, faces twisted in terror, hands clawing at unseen walls, eyes wide with silent screams. And always at the center, that whispering voice, promising release only through sacrifice. I awoke gasping, sweat slick against my skin, the dawn's pale light filtering weakly through the window. The fear lingered, a cold residue in my bones. Something about this place was wrong, deeply, irrevocably wrong. Yet, I felt drawn in, as if the nightmare had reached across the divide to touch me personally. Over the following days, I explored the town, noting the furtive glances and tight-lipped conversations. The people moved like shadows themselves, their faces etched with exhaustion and dread. In the market, a man hurried past me, eyes darting nervously, whispering under his breath about the dream and the end coming soon. At the inn, Ellen remained my quiet confidant, though her words were measured and cautious. "This town holds its breath," she said once, "waiting for something it cannot stop." I began keeping a dream journal, recording the fragments of visions and whispers that plagued my nights. Each entry deepened the mystery and my unease. The nightmare was not just a dream, but a shared torment, a collective fear that bound the townsfolk and me inextricably. One evening, as I walked beneath the grey sky, I passed the town square where a few residents gathered silently. Their eyes met mine, hollow and haunted. I felt the weight of their gaze, a silent plea mixed with warning. I was a stranger, yet somehow the center of this dark tapestry. That night, the dream returned with renewed ferocity. The whispers sharpened into voices I could almost understand, chanting a name I did not know but felt compelled to answer. Shadows reached out with cold fingers, pulling me deeper into the void where the nightmare lived. I awoke again, breathless and trembling. The line between sleep and waking blurred, and I knew my arrival had stirred something ancient and terrible. The nightmare was no accident, no random terror, it was a prophecy, and I was at its heart. The mountain winds moaned outside, a mournful chorus to the darkness that awaited. I had come seeking peace, but found only shadows and whispers. The nightmare had begun, and it would not end until I did. The mountains outside the inn were cloaked in a dense, ever-present mist that seemed to swallow the sunlight whole. As the day wore on, I found myself wandering through the common room of the inn, a modest building with peeling wallpaper and a faint scent of wood smoke lingering in the air. The townsfolk were gathered in small clusters, their voices low and guarded, as if speaking too loudly might awaken some dormant terror. Ellen Royce, the caretaker of this modest refuge, moved silently among them, wiping tables with slow, deliberate motions. Her eyes carried a kindness that seemed to struggle against the pervasive unease that hung thick in the air. I had seen her glance at me several times, her gaze filled with something unspoken, a mix of pity and warning. I approached her during a rare lull, the clinking of cups and murmurs fading into a background hum. "The nights here," she said softly, "they don't just rest. They come alive in ways that aren't easy to explain." Her words sent a shiver down my spine. "What do you mean?" She hesitated, glancing toward the window, where the mist pressed against the glass like a living thing. "The nightmare, it's not just in dreams. It's in the silence, the shadows that linger after the lights go out. The inn, it's seen it all." That night I sat by the bedside lamp, the flickering light casting long shadows across the room. I pulled out a small notebook I'd found in my pack, deciding to keep a dream journal. The first entry was a mess of fragmented whispers and shadowy images that refused to settle into clarity. I wrote down the phrases I heard in the night, words that seemed to pulse with a life of their own, a chilling chorus that echoed in the darkest corners of my mind. The more I wrote, the more the nightmare seemed to seep into my waking thoughts. The lines between dream and reality blurred until I wasn't sure which was more frightening. I could still feel the weight of the darkness pressing down, the whispers curling around my senses like smoke. Breakfast the next morning was a study in tension. The townsfolk ate in silence, their eyes avoiding mine. A mother clutched her child tightly, her face pale and drawn. I caught fleeting glances of fear and resignation, a shared burden that bound them all. It was as if the nightmare was a living thing, pulsing beneath the surface of their forced calm. Later, Ellen pulled me aside once more, her voice barely above a whisper. "The inn holds memories," she said, "of nights when the nightmare was strongest. It's like a beacon, drawing it closer. You need to be careful." Her warning settled heavily in my chest. The dream journal felt heavier in my hands, a silent testament to the invisible terror that gripped the town. I realized then that I was no longer a mere observer. I was becoming part of the nightmare's unfolding story. As the day faded into night, the whispers returned in full force. Sleep offered no respite. Instead, it dragged me deeper into the darkness. And yet, a stubborn curiosity kept me tethered, a need to understand the nightmare that had already begun to consume the town and, now, me. The echoes of the dream were growing louder, and I could no longer ignore their call. The mist hung thick and palpable as I stepped onto the town's main street, the dampness seeping through the soles of my shoes, chilling me from within. The streetlights cast weak halos into the fog, their glow swallowed by the swirling gray that clung to every building and tree. Silence pressed heavily on the town, but it was not a peaceful silence, it was the kind that held its breath, waiting for something to break it. As I walked, I noticed the windows of the shops and homes were dark, save for a flicker here and there of candlelight or the faint glow of a television. Faces appeared briefly at curtained windows, eyes sharp and wary, then vanished like ghosts. The townsfolk moved quietly, hurriedly, their steps muffled against the wet pavement. I passed a small group gathered near the corner, their voices low and urgent despite the chill night air. I slowed, trying to catch fragments of their whispered words without drawing attention. The curse returned with him, one voice said, a tremor of fear underlying the words. The nightmare comes again, because of the stranger, another murmured. A cold shiver ran down my spine, not from the damp or the cold, but from the implication. My arrival here, this stranger seeking refuge, was not a coincidence. It was the spark that had rekindled the town's long-held terror. I pressed forward, feeling the weight of unseen eyes on my back. At the diner, a bell tinkled softly as I entered, the warmth inside a stark contrast to the chill outside. A few patrons looked up briefly, then returned to their hushed conversations. The stale aroma of coffee, mixed with the sharp scent of fried food, filled the cramped space. I settled into a booth by the window, pulling out my dream journal to jot down the unsettling whispers that had invaded my sleep since arriving here. From the corner of my eye, I caught snippets of speech that made my pen pause. He's the key, the prophecy, it's tied to him. The words sent a jolt of unease rippling through me. I was no longer just a visitor. I was a part of something far darker and more profound than I had imagined. Later, near the town hall, a harsh voice broke through the night's quiet. Caleb Trent stepped out from the shadows, cigarette smoldering between his fingers, his eyes narrowing as they fixed on me. "You don't belong here," he said bluntly, the lines of his grizzled face hardening. "This town's got its own ghosts, and you're stirring up more than you realize." I met his glare steadily, feeling the sting of his skepticism, but also the desperation beneath it. "I'm just trying to understand," I replied. "There's something wrong with this place, something tied to me." He scoffed, flicking ash onto the damp ground. "You want to believe in curses and prophecies. Fine. But don't drag the rest of us down with you." The wind picked up, cutting sharp and cold through the gaps in our jackets, as if the night itself sided with Caleb's warning. I left him there, the air heavy with unspoken threats and warnings. My path took me to the town square, where an ancient stone monument stood, gnarled and worn by time. Moss crept over the faded inscriptions, the words almost lost but still holding power. I ran my fingers over the cold surface, feeling the rough texture beneath my skin. A whisper stirred in the wind, barely audible but unmistakable voices, just beyond the edge of hearing. They seemed to speak of fate, of cycles unbroken, of shadows that would not release their hold. The town was alive with fear, and that fear was a living thing, pressing in on me from all sides. I realized then that my arrival had not only awakened the nightmare, it had made me its center. The prophecy was no vague legend. It was a binding decree that I was at the heart of. And the whispers, the shadows, the fear, they were all warnings, or perhaps invitations, to a fate I was only beginning to understand. As I turned away from the monument, the mist thickened, swallowing the light and the world around me. I felt eyes following, voices murmuring just beyond comprehension. The town's secrets were closing in, and I was caught in the middle, a stranger no longer, but a key player in a story older than any of us. The night deepened, and with it, the nightmare whispered louder, promising that the end was closer than I dared imagine. I had to uncover the truth before it consumed me and the town along with me. But the question that haunted me most was this: what price would I have to pay to silence the whispers and end the nightmare once and for all? And as the mist curled around the street lamps, I knew the answer would come with a cost far greater than I had yet fathomed. I had been nursing my third cup of bitter coffee when Margaret Halloway finally approached me. The inn's common room was nearly empty, save for a few murmuring townsfolk huddled in shadowed corners. Margaret's sharp, silver eyes locked onto mine with a gravity that made me straighten in my seat, despite the exhaustion that weighed down my limbs. She moved with a quiet purpose, the dark shawl draped over her frail shoulders whispering secrets, as she crossed the worn wooden floor. When she stopped beside my table, her voice was a low murmur, barely loud enough for me alone. "You don't belong here," she said, her words as much a statement as a warning. "And yet, you've brought what's been sleeping back to life." I blinked, startled by the bluntness of her assertion. "I'm just passing through," I replied cautiously. "I didn't mean to disturb anything." Her lips pressed into a thin line. "No one passes through here without waking the dream. It's tied to you now." The chill in her words sent a shiver down my spine. I leaned in, curiosity overpowering my fatigue. What dream? What nightmare? Margaret hesitated, glancing around the room as if the shadows themselves might be listening. Then, with a sigh, she motioned for me to follow her outside. The mountain air was thick with mist, the street lamps casting hazy pools of light that barely pierced the fog. We walked in silence, the only sound the soft crunch of gravel beneath our feet. After several minutes, we reached a small clearing where an ancient, moss-covered shrine stood, its weathered stones etched with symbols I couldn't decipher. Margaret placed a trembling hand on the shrine's surface. "This marks the beginning," she said. "The place where the nightmare took root long ago, when the town was still young and innocent." I swallowed hard, the weight of her words sinking in. And the prophecy. She reached into her shawl and withdrew a worn journal, its leather cracked and faded with age. Opening it carefully, she revealed pages filled with cryptic entries, fragments of dreams, warnings, and the names of those who had vanished over the decades. "The nightmare is a cycle," Margaret explained. "It feeds on our fear, our despair, and it waits for the one who awakens it to pay the price." My heart pounded as I scanned the faded script, each word a dagger of dread. The lines hinted at a connection between the newcomer and the town's fate, an inescapable bond sealed by death. Before I could ask more, a sudden gust of icy wind swept through the clearing, snuffing out the small lanterns Margaret had lit. Darkness enveloped us, thick and suffocating. I fumbled for my flashlight, its beam barely cutting through the fog. Margaret's voice trembled as she whispered, "Be careful. The nightmare is closer than you think." We returned to the inn in silence, the weight of her revelation pressing down on me like the heavy mountain mist outside. I knew then that my quest for peace was over. The nightmare had found me, and I was its reluctant herald. That night, as I lay in the creaking bed of my rented room, the whispers returned, soft, insistent, calling me deeper into the darkness. I opened my dream journal and began to write, desperate to capture the terror before it consumed me entirely. Margaret's caution was not just a warning, it was a challenge. To uncover the truth, I would have to confront the shadows not only lurking in the town's past, but within myself. And the cost of failure was clear. The nightmare would not end until I did. The silence of the night was broken only by the faintest whisper, a voice that seemed to seep from the walls themselves. They whispered the ending before it began. And somewhere in the depths of that darkness, I knew the nightmare was waiting. The fading light of day settled over the town like a slow, creeping shadow, swallowing the last glimmers of warmth and hope. I stood at the edge of the town square, watching the townsfolk gather with a quiet urgency that felt both routine and desperate. Their faces were drawn and pale, eyes heavy with exhaustion that no amount of sleep seemed to ease. The chill in the air deepened as dusk turned to night, and the faint murmur of whispered prayers drifted on the wind, mingling with the soft flicker of candlelight that dotted the square like trembling stars. No one spoke above a hush. The words seemed too fragile, too charged with meaning to be spoken aloud. I could feel the weight of their shared fear pressing down on me like a physical force. These nightly rituals were not just tradition, they were a collective act of defiance against a darkness that threatened to consume them whole. Yet, there was a palpable sense of futility beneath the surface, a silent acknowledgement that these efforts might only stave off the inevitable for a little while longer. Margaret Halloway approached me then, her sharp eyes reflecting the candlelight as she motioned me to follow her inside her home. The interior was dim and sparse, the air thick with the scent of herbs and old wood. On a worn table she carefully arranged small charms and bundles of dried herbs, her hands steady but trembling ever so slightly. She began murmuring a chant, ancient words I could barely understand but sensed were woven with sorrow and hope. I watched as the ritual unfolded, the fragile hope in Margaret's voice a stark contrast to the deep fear in her eyes. "We do what we can," she said quietly, "but the nightmare. It's a tide we cannot turn back. We only hold the line for a moment, before it breaks again." That night, back in my room at the inn, I sat by the window, the cold glass pressing against my cheek as I gazed out over the empty streets. Shadows lengthened and stretched across cobblestones, twisting into shapes that felt alive with menace. The silence was thick, broken only by the faint rustle of wind and the distant murmur of voices in prayer. I could almost hear the whispers, the insidious breath of the dream entity weaving its way through the town's collective consciousness. The rituals, the prayers, the charms, they were threads in a fraying tapestry. Efforts to hold back a darkness that seeped into every corner of the town and every mind within it. I felt the nightmares pull in my own bones, a cold claw gripping at my resolve. Despite all their efforts, the townsfolk were shackled by fear, bound in a shared silence that spoke volumes about their helplessness. Yet amidst the despair, a small ember flickered within me. To understand this nightmare, to confront the force that held this town captive, I had to grasp the depth of their terror and my own role in it. This was no ordinary fear. It was a living, breathing entity, feeding on our dread and growing stronger with every whispered prayer and every futile ritual. As the night deepened, I scribbled in my dream journal, the words catching in my throat. The nightmare was no longer just a dream, it was a sentence, a merciless chain binding us all to a fate none dared speak aloud. And at its center I was the key. Outside, the wind carried the faintest echoes of the whispered prayers, fragile against the relentless dark. The town was bound by fear, and I was bound to it. As the candle burned low, I knew the nightmare would not release us easily, and that my own journey was just beginning. The candle guttered, casting long shadows that danced on the walls like silent warnings. I closed my journal, the weight of the night pressing down as I braced myself for what lay ahead. The nightmare was everywhere, and the town was its unwilling host. But I was no longer just an outsider. I was a part of this dark story, whether I wanted to be or not. And as the whispers rose again on the wind, I knew the nightmare was watching, waiting, and it would not rest until its prophecy was fulfilled. I first noticed Caleb Trent on my third morning in the town, standing outside the weathered general store with his usual grim expression, a cigarette smoldering between his fingers. His grizzled beard and rugged features gave him the look of a man who'd seen too much and wanted to see no more. I'd heard whispers about him, the local skeptic, the man who refused to bow to the town's creeping dread. When I approached, the low murmur of the morning breeze mingled with the faint buzz of cicadas, their calls oddly distant, as if the town itself was holding its breath. "You're stirring up trouble," Caleb said, eyes narrowing as he flicked ash onto the cracked pavement. "I'm just trying to understand," I replied cautiously, my voice betraying the fatigue that clung to my bones like a second skin. He shook his head, a bitter laugh escaping his lips. "Understanding won't save you here. This town's got its ghosts, sure, but chasing shadows won't help. Best you let it be." The weight behind his words was unmistakable. There was fear there, but not the white-knuckled kind. It was a tired, resigned terror that had settled into his bones long ago. I pressed on anyway, driven by the relentless whispers that haunted my dreams and the faces of the townsfolk, all etched with the same haunted look. That evening, the bar was thick with the haze of smoke and muted conversations. I found Caleb nursing a glass of something dark and bitter. The moment I sat down, his eyes locked onto mine, unblinking and sharp. "You're not like the others," he said bluntly. "You ask questions they don't want answered." "Because those questions matter," I said. "Because this nightmare, it's not just a dream, it's real. And it's tied to me." He scoffed, dragging the cigarette from his lips. You think you're special, that this curse revolves around you. That's dangerous thinking. Our conversation spiraled quickly, words clashing like thunder in the quiet room. Caleb's skepticism was a fortress, built from years of denial and pain. He dismissed every theory I laid out, every strange occurrence I described. But beneath his harshness, I sensed a man battling his own demons, desperate to hold on to control in a town slipping further into despair. Later, walking back to the inn, the fog had thickened, swallowing the street lamps whole. The silence was oppressive, punctuated only by the echo of my footsteps and the distant call of an owl. Shadows lengthened, whispering secrets I wasn't yet ready to hear. Caleb's words echoed in my mind, a warning and a challenge. Was I chasing a phantom, or was he the one blinded by disbelief? The next day, the town felt colder, as if Caleb's confrontation had drawn a line in the mist. People avoided my gaze, their fear now tinged with suspicion. I carried my dream journal everywhere, scribbling fragments of whispered warnings and shadowy shapes that invaded my sleep. One night, as I sat by the window, the voice came again, soft, insistent, threading through the darkness like silk and poison. Stop, it whispered. Let it be. I clenched my fists, the chill crawling up my spine. Caleb's face flashed before me, his eyes filled with both defiance and despair. The skeptic's shadow loomed large, a mirror of my own doubts and fears, but I couldn't stop, not yet. I had to know the truth, no matter the cost. And as the night deepened, the whispers grew louder, wrapping around me like the cold embrace of the nightmare itself. The town was watching and waiting. I was no longer a stranger here. I was part of the story, tangled in the web of fear and silence that bound us all. The fog clung thickly to the narrow streets of the town as I stepped out of the inn, the cold dampness seeping through the thin soles of my boots. The night was unnervingly silent except for the soft crunch of gravel underfoot and the distant, almost imperceptible rustle of wind-stirred leaves. Yet, beneath this stillness, there was a subtle vibration in the air, an undercurrent of whispers that seemed to curl around the edges of my hearing, teasing and taunting, never quite forming words. Returning to my room, I flicked on the weak lamp, its yellow glow barely penetrating the gloom. The peeling wallpaper bore the stains of time and neglect, but as I watched, the shadows cast by the frayed edges seemed to twitch an impossible movement, subtle yet unmistakable. My breath caught. Was it just my eyes playing tricks, or was something darker at work? I shook my head, forcing the thought away, but the whispering persisted. It was as if the nightmare had found a way to seep through the fragile membrane separating sleep from wakefulness, coiling itself around my mind and refusing to let go. The voices were maddeningly close yet maddeningly silent, a paradox that gnawed at my sanity. The following day, I wandered the mist-laden streets, hoping the daylight would offer some reprieve. But the town seemed to hold its breath, every face I passed etched with the same haunted look, eyes darting nervously as though chased by unseen terrors. Then, out of the corner of my eye, movement dark, shifting shapes slipping between buildings. When I turned to look directly, there was nothing but empty alleyways and the chill that seemed to seep from the stone walls. I found myself retreating more and more, the line between reality and nightmare blurring with each passing hour. Conversations became fragmented. Voices echoed where no one stood. The inn, my only refuge, felt less safe by the day. Ellen Royce, the caretaker, offered quiet support. One evening, as the creaking floorboards groaned beneath her cautious steps, she leaned close. Her voice a low whisper barely audible over the hum that seemed to rise from the very walls. "They don't just stay in your dreams anymore," she said, her eyes reflecting a sorrow I couldn't fully understand. "The nightmare is waking with you." Her words sent a shiver down my spine. I wanted to ask what she meant, but no words came. Instead, I nodded, feeling the weight of her knowledge settle upon me like a shroud. Back in my room that night, the shadows grew bolder. My own silhouette stretched and contorted across the floor, elongating impossibly until the fingers of darkness reached out toward me. The whispering voices surged into a tempest of indistinct threats and promises, each syllable a dagger slicing through my resolve. I stumbled back, heart pounding, struggling to breathe in the choking atmosphere. Panic clawed at me, but beneath the terror, a grim determination took root. I realized that the nightmare wasn't just a dream, it was an invasion, a suffocating presence intent on consuming every fragment of my waking life. Yet, as terrifying as it was, this crossing of boundaries offered a terrible clarity. If the nightmare could touch my reality, then perhaps I could find a way to fight back, to unravel the threads binding us all in this shared torment. But first, I had to survive the night and the shadows that whispered my name with voices not my own. The lines were blurring, between dream and life, between hope and despair, and I was trapped in the middle, a solitary figure caught in the relentless tide of darkness. I knew the nightmare was watching, waiting, and so was I. The night was far from over, and the whispers were only growing louder. The evening had wrapped the town in its thick, breathless silence when Margaret Halloway finally invited me into the heart of the secret I had been chasing since my arrival. Her small house, perched on the edge of the village like a sentinel watching over a fragile peace, smelled of aged wood and dusty paper, a scent that seemed to hold the weight of countless unspoken horrors. As I stepped through the doorway, the dim glow of a dying fire cast long shadows that danced across the walls, their flicker feeling less like mere light and more like restless spirits watching from the dark corners. Margaret's sharp eyes, bright despite the years etched into her face, fixed on me with a mixture of resignation and urgency. "Sit," she said, her voice low but steady. "There is something you need to see, something that has been kept hidden for generations." I obeyed, the floorboards creaking beneath my feet as I settled across from her at a small, rough-hewn table cluttered with relics of a time long past. The air was thick with anticipation, and an almost tangible tension hung between us. Margaret moved with deliberate care to a worn wooden box, its surface scarred by time and use. She unclasped the lid, revealing a collection of brittle papers, faded photographs, and a single parchment that immediately drew my attention. It was a sheet of parchment, yellowed and fragile, curled at the edges. The ink was faded but still legible, scrawled in a looping, archaic script that seemed to pulse with a silent, ominous power. Her fingers trembled slightly as she lifted it, the weight of its contents pressing down on the room like a physical force. "This," she said, placing the parchment gently between us, "is a fragment of the prophecy that binds this town and you to the nightmare." I leaned in, my eyes tracing the strange symbols and cryptic words. They spoke of darkness rising from forgotten sins, of a shadow that would crawl through the dreams of all, and of a singular presence whose arrival would signal the beginning of the end. My heart hammered painfully against my ribs as the realization dawned. The nightmare was not just a shared dream, but a curse intertwined with my very existence. Margaret's voice broke the silence again, quieter now, laced with fear. They called it the Whisperer, an ancient force feeding on our dread. It was born from a terrible event, long buried beneath the soil and memory. The prophecy says that when the outsider comes, the nightmare will consume us all, but it will end only with his death. The air seemed to grow heavier, the flickering firelight casting grotesque shadows that writhed like living things. Outside, the wind moaned mournfully, scraping against the windows as if mourning the fate laid bare within these walls. I felt the sting of tears, or perhaps it was sweat, as the weight of the truth settled over me. The town's fear was no longer distant or abstract, it was my burden to carry. The nightmare was not merely a torment to survive. It was a sentence written in my name. My mind raced, grappling with the impossible choice ahead. To fight meant risking everything, yet surrendering seemed like sealing our doom. The prophecy was a cage with no lock, but one I alone could open with a final, irrevocable act. Margaret's gaze held mine, unyielding and sorrowful. You must decide, though I fear the path is already chosen." The candle flames flickered violently, shadows twisting into shapes both familiar and monstrous. In that moment, the boundary between the living world and the nightmare thinned until they bled into one another. I was no longer a mere observer, I was the pivot on which this dark story turned. As the night deepened, I sat there with the prophecy laid bare before me, my resolve coalescing like ice in my veins. The nightmare's end was tethered to my fate, and I could no longer run from the whispers that clawed at my soul. But even as despair threatened to consume me, a small ember of defiance kindled within the fragile hope that perhaps, in confronting this darkness, I might find a way to rewrite the ending. The nightmare was no longer just theirs, it was mine, and the clock was ticking. Outside Margaret's house, the town lay silent beneath a thick blanket of mist. The mountains loomed like silent sentinels, their peaks swallowed by the night. Somewhere, a dog barked a brief, sharp noise that shattered the stillness. I rose from the table, the prophecy's weight a physical ache in my chest. My footsteps echoed softly on the wooden floor as I prepared to face the long night ahead, haunted by knowledge that could neither be unlearned nor escaped. The nightmare had found its heart, and it beat within me. Nightmares multiply, the darkness pressed in tighter now, suffocating in its persistence. Each evening, as the sun bled behind the mountain ridges, the town seemed to shrink, folding inward beneath a weight that no one could name aloud. I could hear it in the way the streets emptied faster, the way the few who remained moved like shadows themselves, quiet, watchful, and utterly drained. That night, the nightmare came back with a ferocity that stole my breath. I woke gasping, tangled in sweat-soaked sheets, my heart hammering against ribs that felt too fragile. The dreamscape had twisted into a labyrinth of shifting shadows, whispers curling around me like smoke. They murmured secrets I barely caught, names, warnings, fragmented phrases that slipped away before meaning could form. The darkness wasn't just around me. It was inside, invading my very chest, squeezing until I feared I might suffocate. By morning, the town wore the nightmare on its faces. I saw it in Margaret's sharp eyes, dulled now by exhaustion and something deeper and ancient, weary sorrow. In the market, a cluster of residents huddled together, their voices hushed, their bodies trembling. I caught tears on the wind, silent sobs that broke the fragile veneer of composure. Some averted their eyes when I approached. Others stared with a haunted desperation that made me want to reach out and pull them from the abyss. "It's getting worse," Margaret admitted later that day when I visited her home, the dim light barely illuminating the lines etched deep into her face. "The nightmare grows stronger, feeding on our fear, spreading like a sickness. We re-unraveling." Her words hung heavy between us. The fragile peace I'd sought here was unraveling, and I was at the center of the storm. The dream was no longer a distant torment shared in the quiet of night, it was bleeding into waking hours, fracturing minds and fraying nerves. Caleb's confrontation that afternoon was anything but subtle. He cornered me outside the inn, cigarette smoke curling around his grizzled beard as his voice sharpened with accusation. "You don't belong here," he spat, eyes blazing with a mix of anger and fear. "You stir things better left buried." His words cut deeper than I expected, for beneath the bitterness trembled a man grappling with his own terror, one he refused to name. Caleb was a wall of denial, and yet even he was crumbling. Later, I found myself wandering the mist-shrouded streets, the oppressive silence broken only by my footsteps and distant, fractured whispers. Tommy Holloway's face appeared in my mind, the boy's wide eyes, a fragile spark of hope amidst the encroaching despair. He was a reminder of what was at stake. The nightmare wasn't just a curse on the town, but a threat to every soul trapped within it. That night, I kept my dream journal close, fingers trembling as I wrote down the disjointed images and voices that haunted my sleep. The nightmare had multiplied, its tendrils reaching deeper into my mind, blurring the line between memory and prophecy, fear and reality. I knew then that the town was unraveling, and with it, the fragile hope that things might end without bloodshed. The whispers had grown louder, the shadows longer, and the price of survival higher than I dared imagine. As the darkness deepened, I understood that my fight was no longer just for myself, but for the town and for the fragile threads of hope that still flickered within Tummy's eyes. And so, with a heart heavy yet resolute, I prepared to face the nightmare once more, knowing that the road ahead would stretch into the deepest shadows yet. The wind outside rattled the window panes, carrying the distant howl of some unseen creature. I stared at the scrawled words in my journal, fragments of dreams too terrible and fragmented to understand fully. The nightmare was no longer a shared experience but a personal hell, a relentless tide pulling me under. I closed the journal, the echo of whispers still ringing in my ears. Tomorrow, I would seek Margaret again. Tomorrow, I would try to unravel the dark thread that bound us all. Because the nightmare was multiplying, and if I didn't act, it would consume us all. The night stretched on, and the whispers never ceased. The evening air hung thick with mist, curling around the faded facades of the town's buildings like a ghostly shroud. I walked through the quiet streets, the crunch of my boots on the damp gravel the only sound breaking the stillness. My thoughts churned relentlessly, tangled with fragments of dreams and whispered warnings that clung to my mind like cobwebs. It was then, near the edge of the town square, that I saw him, a small figure standing alone beneath a sputtering street lamp. Tommy Halloway, Margaret's grandson. He was no more than 10, his slight frame swallowed by an oversized coat that hung loosely on his narrow shoulders. In his arms, he cradled a threadbare stuffed bear, its fur matted and worn from years of silent companionship. His wide eyes, bright but shadowed with fear, flicked nervously toward the shifting shadows that seemed to stretch and contract like living things around us. I hesitated, uncertain whether to approach. But something in that child's gaze, a fragile mix of hope and terror, pulled me forward. The nightmare had stolen so much from this town, but here was a spark of something pure, untouched by despair. Tommy. My voice was softer than I intended, but it drew his attention. He blinked, then took a hesitant step toward me. You knew, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Yes, I just arrived, I replied, kneeling to be more level with him. I know this town isn't easy. The dreams, the fear, he nodded, clutching his bear tighter. They won't stop. They come every night. We stood there in silence for a moment, the mist swirling between us, the world beyond the square fading into shadow. In that quiet, I sensed the weight of what this boy carried, a burden no child should bear. Why do you stay? I asked. Don't you want to run? Tommy's lips trembled, and for a moment I thought he might cry. Instead he straightened, eyes meeting mine with a fierce determination that belied his youth. Because someone has to remember, he said simply. His words struck me harder than any nightmare. The town's history, its secrets, its pain held in the fragile hands of a child. He took my hand and led me away from the square, down a narrow alley where the mist thinned and the air smelled faintly of pine and earth. There, tucked between two crumbling stone walls, was a small alcove filled with relics, faded photographs, cracked letters, and a dusty wooden box etched with the town's old emblem. Tommy pointed to a photograph of a group of solemn-faced townsfolk standing before a church, their eyes hollow, shadows dark beneath them. That's the night it started, he whispered. The night the darkness came. I reached out, tracing the worn edges of the photo, feeling the cold bite of history settle over me. The nightmare was not just a dream, it was a wound that time had refused to heal. As twilight deepened, the chill in the air grew sharper. Tommy shivered, and I pulled my coat tighter around me. Our eyes met again, and in that shared gaze was a silent pact. We would face the darkness together, no matter the cost. I won't let it win, I promised. He nodded, a small, hopeful smile flickering across his lips. Then maybe we have a chance. The mist thickened once more as we made our way back toward the heart of the town. Behind us, the shadows whispered, But for the first time in days, I felt a flicker of something I hadn't dared to hope for. A glimmer of light in the suffocating darkness. But the nightmare was far from over, and as the night pressed in around us, I knew that Tommy's innocence was both a beacon and a target. Protecting him meant confronting the Whisperer and accepting the terrible truth that my own fate was entwined with the town's salvation. With renewed resolve, I prepared to face whatever horrors lay ahead. The path was dark, the stakes impossibly high, but I had found a reason to fight. For Tommy, for the town, for the fragile hope that even in the deepest shadow, light could still be found. And with that, the nightmare's whispers grew louder, as if angered by my defiance. But I was no longer alone. The battle was just beginning. The night crept in with its usual quiet menace, but something was different this time. I awoke not to the usual numbness of sleep's end, but to a sharp, gnawing unease crawling beneath my skin. The room was bathed in a pale, merciless moonlight that filtered through the cracked window panes, casting long, distorted shadows that seemed to twitch with a life of their own. As I blinked the remnants of sleep from my eyes, my gaze fell on the wall opposite my bed. There, scratched into the faded wallpaper, were jagged lines cryptic, uneven scars that hadn't been there the night before. My heart thudded in my chest as I edged closer, fingers brushing against the rough texture of the marks. They seemed to writhe subtly, as if the wall itself was breathing, alive with a sinister message I couldn't yet decipher. The air around me thickened, pressing in with cold familiarity. I swallowed hard, the taste of iron sharp on my tongue, and the whisper came soft, almost imperceptible, a voice curling like smoke around my ear. "You cannot hide," it breathed, syllables like the rustling of dead leaves. "We are one." I spun around, eyes searching the dim corners of the room, but I was alone. The whisper lingered, a cruel melody threading through the silence. Memories of the shared nightmare flooded back the endless darkness, the suffocating whispers, the chilling promise that the nightmare would end only when I died. But now, the entity was no longer confined to the dreamscape. It had crossed the veil into the waking world. My reflection caught my eye from the cracked mirror hanging crookedly on the wall. For a fleeting heartbeat, my eyes were not my own. Shadows danced within their depths, shifting and swirling like smoke, a dark presence staring back at me. Panic surged, hot and unrelenting. Was I losing my mind, or was the boundary between dream and reality truly dissolving? I reached out to touch the glass, and a sharp coldness bit into my fingertips. The room trembled suddenly, a low, violent shudder that rattled the windows and sent a cascade of dust motes swirling in the moonbeam. The lights flickered and died, plunging me into a darkness so complete it felt suffocating. The whisper grew louder, a chorus now wrapping around me, filling the space between my ragged breaths. "You belong to us," it hissed. "The nightmare lives through you." I sank to the floor, heart hammering, mind fraying at the edges. The nightmare was no longer a shadow at the edge of sleep, it was here. With me, inside me, invading every waking moment. The fight to hold on to sanity was becoming a battle I wasn't sure I could win. As the hours stretched on, the lines between night and day blurred, the whispers never ceasing, the messages multiplying on the walls and across every surface. Each mark was a brand, each whisper a chain. I knew then that the dream entity was tightening its grip, and my only choice was to confront it before the nightmare consumed not just the town, but me. But how do you fight a shadow that lives in your mind and your blood? How do you resist a fate whispered before you even arrived? The answer eluded me as the darkness closed in, and I understood with a crushing certainty that my journey was far from over. It was about to descend into the very heart of terror itself. The night stretched on, merciless and unyielding, and I was left alone with the whispers, the shadows, and the fading boundaries between what was real and what was nightmare. Night fell like a heavy curtain, swallowing the town in its ink-black embrace. I lay awake in the dim room of the inn, the thin walls creaking as the wind whispered secrets I could not decipher. My mind, already frayed by restless nights and unspoken fears, clung desperately to the fragile hope that this evening might bring relief from the relentless nightmare. But hope was a fragile ember in a storm of shadows. As sleep finally claimed me, it dragged me beneath its surface like a drowning man, pulling me into the familiar abyss of the shared nightmare. The darkness was immediate and suffocating, an all-encompassing void that swallowed sound and light. Whispers slithered through the blackness, curling and twisting around me like serpents. At first, I thought they were distant, harmless murmurs, but their tone quickly turned sinister, intimate. They knew me. They called my name soft, cruel, and relentless. I tried to run, to tear myself free from the choking dream, but the darkness resisted. It was alive, a living entity with tendrils that coiled around my limbs, anchoring me in place. The whispers grew louder, overlapping into a cacophony of voices that promised despair and doom. Faces flickered in the shadows, twisted, malformed reflections of the townsfolk, their eyes hollow and accusing. Their voices blended into a chorus of blame and warning, a prophecy etched in torment. Suddenly, the dreamscape shifted violently. The ground beneath me crumbled, plunging me into an endless chasm where time lost meaning. Shadows danced at the edges of my vision, their movements erratic and threatening. I could feel the entity's presence, cold and malevolent, pressing against my mind, invading every thought. Panic surged through me, a desperate, animalistic urge to survive. I screamed, silent and futile, a plea swallowed by the void. My hands flailed, grasping for any anchor in the shifting nightmare, but there was none. The tendrils tightened, constricting like iron bands, squeezing the breath from my lungs. I was trapped, a prisoner to the entity's will. Then, abruptly, I jolted awake, gasping for air. The room was dark and still, the only sound my ragged breathing. Sweat clung to my skin, cold and clammy. My heart pounded like a war drum, each beat echoing the terror I had just endured. But the nightmare was not confined to sleep. As my eyes adjusted, I noticed the bruises, dark purple marks blooming on my forearms and neck, as if the dream had left its cruel fingerprints on my flesh. A low whisper seemed to hang in the stillness, too faint to grasp, but unmistakably present. It was the voice of the whisperer, the dream entity, a reminder that the boundary between dream and waking had thinned dangerously. Resistance was not only futile, it was a trap, a game rigged to break me down. I sat on the edge of the bed, hands trembling, wrestling with the crushing weight of despair. Every instinct screamed to flee, to escape the town and the nightmare that had ensnared it. But deep down, I knew that flight was impossible. The entity's grip was absolute. It fed on our fear, our helplessness, growing stronger with each failed attempt at defiance. Outside, the wind howled through the trees, carrying with it the faintest echo of whispered warnings. I was caught in a web of ancient prophecy and collective dread, a single thread woven into the fabric of a nightmare that demanded my surrender. Yet, amid the suffocating darkness, a flicker of defiance remained, a fragile spark of will. If resistance was futile, perhaps understanding the nature of the nightmare and the entity that controlled it was the only path left. The dream journal lay on the desk, filled with fragmented whispers and shadowed images that might hold the key to unraveling this torment. I forced myself to stand, muscles etching, and reached for the pen. The nightmare was relentless, but so was I. Even as the shadows pressed in, even as the whispers clawed at my sanity, I would not let the darkness claim me without a fight. Tomorrow, I would seek Margaret again, press her for more of the truth she guarded so fiercely. Tonight I would write, capturing every detail before it slipped away like a fading nightmare. The path ahead was shrouded in fear and uncertainty, but it was mine to walk. Resistance was futile, but surrender was not yet an option. The darkness waited, patient and eternal, but so did I. And in that fragile balance, the story of the town and my own would unfold. The thin light filtering through the grimy window pane barely illuminated the cramped study where I sat, hunched over a fragile pile of papers that seemed older than the town itself. Dust motes floated in the stale air, suspended like tiny ghosts. Margaret Halloway sat opposite me, her sharp eyes fixed on the faded pages as if they might bite her. The silence between us was heavy, broken only by the faint scratching of my pen as I copied down lines from the brittle documents, desperate to piece together the puzzle. This town, Margaret began, her voice a low whisper, was built on a foundation of fear and sacrifice. She folded her hands tightly, the knuckles white beneath her dark shawl. Long before any of us were born, before the roads and houses, there was an event, a terrible night that stained the land. I leaned in, heart pounding. What happened? She hesitated, then drew a brittle map of the town's outskirts, marking a spot near the river where the ruins of the old church still stood, a restless spirit bound in blood and desperation. The founding families made a pact to imprison it, but the price was heavy: their souls, their peace, and a curse that would haunt every generation. The weight of her words pressed down on me like the thick mountain mist outside. I felt the chill of something ancient and malevolent stretching through time, threading its way into the present nightmare. Determined to see for myself, I ventured to the crumbling church as twilight bled into darkness. The heavy wooden doors groaned in protest as I pushed them open, stepping into the stale, cavernous space. The air was thick with dust, and something metallic, a faint copper tang that made my throat tighten. Faded bloodstains marred the floorboards, half erased by time but still glaringly visible. The silence was suffocating, broken only by the echo of my footsteps and the distant howling wind. As I traced the outline of the altar, a sudden vision seized me, a brutal flicker of the past. Torches flared in the darkness, casting long, dancing shadows. Desperate voices whispered frantic prayers and curses as a circle of hooded figures chanted in a language I couldn't comprehend. The scent of iron and sweat filled the air, mingling with the sharp bite of fear. I saw a figure, pale and wild-eyed, bound to a wooden stake, the crowd's faces twisted with dread and resolve. The ritual was meant to contain a darkness, but it unleashed something far worse. I staggered back to the present, heart racing, sweat slick on my brow. Margaret was waiting outside, her eyes filled with the same sorrow I felt. That night, she said, marked us all. The nightmare is the echo of that torment, the shadow of a curse none can escape. Back in her study, we pored over faded photographs, town records, and family trees. Each page revealed more of the buried pain, whispered betrayals, vanished children, and silent grief. The town's serene facade was a brittle mask stretched thin over generations of suffering. I could feel the heavy legacy pressing down on me, not just as a visitor, but as the key to its unraveling. The revelation was a double-edged sword. Knowing the nightmare's origin offered a sliver of hope, a path to understanding, but it also chained me tighter to the prophecy. My presence was no accident. It was the spark that rekindled the ancient curse. The dread tightened its grip around my chest, but beneath the fear, a stubborn flame of resolve flickered. I would face this darkness, no matter the cost. As the night deepened outside, the whispers returned soft, insistent, threading through the shadows. The past and present collided in my mind, a relentless echo that promised I had only just begun to uncover the true horror of this town. And with that thought came the haunting certainty: the nightmare was far from over. The town hall was suffused with a stifling heat that belied the chill creeping in through the cracked windows. Shadows clung to the corners of the room like reluctant witnesses, their darkness thickening with the rising tension. Caleb Trent stood near the center, cigarette dangling from his lips, smoke curling upward in lazy spirals that seemed to mock the heavy atmosphere. His rugged face was set in a stubborn scowl, eyes cold and unyielding as he faced the gathered townsfolk. The murmurs had grown to a low roar, a mixture of fear, anger, and despair swirling in the musty air. "This prophecy nonsense," Caleb barked, voice sharp and dismissive. "It's a crutch for weak minds. You want to believe the nightmare ends with the death of some drifter. That's madness." A collective gasp rippled through the crowd. Margaret Halloway, seated at the edge, her silver hair a stark beacon in the dim light, narrowed her eyes. Her stoic demeanor wavered just a fraction, but she remained composed, hands folded tightly in her lap. The narrator watched from the back, muscles tense, heart pounding like a drum in his chest. He could see the flickers of fear in the faces around him, the quick glances exchanged, the tightening of jaws. Ellen Royce stood nearby, her gentle gaze fixed on Caleb with a mix of pity and frustration. "Denial won't save us, Caleb," she whispered, more to herself than anyone else. Caleb's laugh was bitter, edged with exhaustion. "Maybe not, but surrendering to this prophecy sure won't. We should be fighting back, not cowering behind old tales." The room erupted into heated voices. Accusations flew like shards of glass, cutting through the fragile peace that had barely held the community together these past weeks. Some pleaded for calm, for unity. Others shouted their despair and anger. The narrator felt the walls closing in, the oppressive weight of collective fear pressing down upon him. Outside, the night was heavy with mist, the mountains looming like silent sentinels. The narrator stepped out into the cold air, trying to find some clarity amid the chaos. Voices drifted out from the hall, shouting, crying, pleading an echo of the nightmare that haunted them all. The street lamp flickered weakly, casting long shadows that danced like restless spirits across the wet pavement. He thought of Tommy Halloway, the boy whose wide eyes held a fragile hope that seemed so easily crushed by the adult's bitterness. The child's innocence was a light in the gathering darkness, a reminder of what hung in the balance. Later, in the quiet refuge of the inn, Margaret approached him. Her sharp eyes searched his face, holding a depth of sorrow and warning. "The town is breaking," she said quietly, voice trembling just slightly. "Fear is a poison, and it spreads faster than any shadow. If we don't hold together, the nightmare will consume us all." Her words settled heavily on him. The fractures in the community were more than just disagreements, they were a symptom of the deeper terror gripping the town. Caleb's defiance, while understandable, threatened to unravel what little cohesion remained. The narrator knew the path forward was fraught with peril. He had to find a way to bridge the growing chasm between belief and skepticism, or risk losing the fragile bonds that might yet save them. But how could he unite a town held hostage by its own fears, when every whispered doubt and shouted denial pushed them further apart? As he lay awake that night, the whispers of the nightmare seeped into his mind once more. The voices spoke of endings and beginnings, of sacrifice and survival. Somewhere between the shadows and the dawn, he had to find his strength or be swallowed by the darkness that threatened to consume them all. The fragile peace was shattered, and with it, the faint hope that had flickered so briefly in the mountain mist. The nightmare was no longer just a dream, it was a living, breathing force tearing the town apart from within. And the narrator stood at its center, caught in a storm of fear, doubt, and the desperate need to survive. But even as the night deepened, a single truth remained clear: the nightmare would not release its grip easily. And the town's fate, his fate, was entwined in a deadly dance from which there might be no escape. The rising storm of conflict was only the beginning, and the narrator could feel the weight of what was to come pressing down like the suffocating darkness that awaited behind closed eyelids. In the distance, a whisper stirred, promising that nothing would ever be the same again. The nightmare's claws were sinking deeper, and the reckoning was fast approaching. The night had settled like a thick, suffocating shroud over the town, but inside my rented room, the darkness was something else entirely. It moved, it breathed, whispered. I sat on the edge of the bed, the thin light from a flickering bulb barely illuminating the peeling wallpaper and the threadbare carpet beneath my feet. Shadows slithered along the corners, alive with a sinister intent that tightened my chest with every passing second. I had told myself this was just my mind playing tricks, a side effect of exhaustion, or the accumulated stress of living among people haunted by a collective nightmare. But the shadows know the entity was no mere trick. It was a presence, ancient and cruel, slipping through the cracks of reality itself to reach me. A faint murmur rose from the darkness, soft and sibilant, like 100 voices whispering secrets I was never meant to hear. I leaned forward, straining to catch the words, but they slipped away like smoke. "You cannot hide," it breathed, the voice weaving around me like a cold wind. "You are the key, the end, the beginning." My breath hitched, the room grew colder, the shadows deepening until they seemed to pool at my feet. I tried to steady my trembling hands, clutching the worn leather cover of my dream journal on the nightstand. The journal was my only tether, a record of fragmented whispers and fleeting images that blurred the line between nightmare and reality. I thought of Margaret's warnings, her stoic face etched with fear the last time we spoke. "The entity feeds on your fear," she had said, her voice low and urgent. "It knows you are different, and it will not let you go easily." A sudden movement caught my eye, a ripple of darkness shifting near the doorway. I blinked, and it was gone. But the feeling lingered, a cold finger tracing along my spine. I swallowed hard, trying to push back the rising tide of panic. I was no stranger to fear, but this was something deeper, more invasive. The next morning, I wandered the fog-laden streets, seeking clarity in the town's muted life. The mist clung to the ground like a living thing, swallowing sounds and softening edges. At the edge of the square, I caught sight of a slender shadow slipping between buildings, its form shifting and indistinct. I called out, but the figure melted into the haze before I could draw closer. The whisper followed me, barely audible yet impossible to ignore. "You belong. You cannot escape," it hissed on the wind. Later, in the local diner, I sat alone at a corner table, nursing a bitter coffee while the few other patrons stared vacantly into their cups. The smell of stale grease and burnt toast hung heavy in the air. The silence was broken only by the occasional clink of silverware and the low murmur of the espresso machine. Then, a voice, soft, intimate, unmistakably my name, slipped through the din. I looked up, heart pounding, but no one met my gaze. The other diners seemed trapped in their own private fog of terror. I folded my hands tightly on the table, willing my mind to stay grounded. But the entity's reach was relentless. That night, when sleep finally claimed me, the nightmare didn't wait. It invaded with a ferocity I hadn't yet experienced, whispers turning to voices, shadows twisting into forms just beyond recognition. In the dreamscape, the whisperer's voice wrapped itself around my thoughts. "You are the seal, the end of the cycle. Without you, the darkness cannot hold. But your death will unbind us all." I woke gasping, sweat slick against my skin, the echo of those words ringing in my mind. The line between what was real and what was dream blurred until I couldn't tell where one ended and the other began. I knew then that the entity's grasp was tightening, that my every waking moment was a battleground. The whispers weren't just torment. They were a call to surrender. But I wasn't ready to give in. I stared out the rain-streaked window into the blackness beyond, knowing the nightmare was no longer confined to sleep. It was here in every shadow, every whisper, every stolen moment of silence. The town was dying in fear, and I was at the center of it all. Tomorrow, I would confront the darkness again, because if I didn't, it would consume not only me but everyone I had come to care for in this broken, haunted place. And the whisperer would win. But tonight I held tightly to the fragile thread of hope that still flickered inside me, fragile as a candle flame in a storm. The nightmare's grasp was strong, but so was my will, and the fight was just beginning. The moment I awoke, the world felt irrevocably wrong. My eyes snapped open to a room saturated in an unnatural darkness, the kind that swallowed every bit of light the moon dared to spill through the grimy window. The shadows no longer rested quietly in the corners. They twisted and writhed like living things, their edges fraying and flickering as if caught in a silent storm. A low murmur filled the air, a chorus of whispers that slithered beneath my skin and wrapped around my mind with icy fingers. I wanted to scream, but the sound caught in my throat. The whispering was not a language I could understand, yet it was intimate, like the voices of 1,000 lost souls sharing secrets I was never meant to hear. I swung my legs over the side of the bed, heart hammering. The floor beneath my feet felt cold and unreal, like stepping onto the surface of a frozen lake ready to crack open. Every breath I drew was shallow, desperate. I reached for the light switch, but the bulb flickered and died, plunging the room into a suffocating void. Panic clawed at me as the whispers swelled, becoming a cacophony of overlapping voices, each vying to be heard but none offering solace. I forced myself to stand, swaying unsteadily as the shadows seemed to pulse with life. Moving towards the window, I peered out into the mountain town, a place that had once seemed so solid, so real. Now it shimmered in the fog like a mirage, the street lamps casting weak halos through the mist. Figures, no, not figures, but dark silhouettes slithered just beyond the reach of the light. Their forms were amorphous, shifting like smoke caught in a breeze, whispering my name in a voice that was both everywhere and nowhere. "You cannot hide," the voice breathed, a sibilant hiss that curled around my mind. I stumbled back, colliding with the wall, the cold plaster biting into my skin. My reflection in the cracked mirror opposite caught my eye. No, not my reflection. The image wavered and contorted, eyes hollow and sunken, mouth twitching in silent screams. It was me, and yet a grotesque parody of myself, a fractured soul twisted by fear and despair. "Face it," the whisper came again, "you belong to the nightmare now." Desperation surged through me. I clawed at the mirror with trembling hands, shards prickling my palms, but the image remained, mocking and unyielding. I shut my eyes tight, willing the nightmare to end, to pull me back into the safety of waking life. But when I opened them again, the boundaries had dissolved completely. The walls around me seemed to breathe, dark tendrils seeping from the corners and pooling on the floor like ink spreading across parchment. The air was thick, heavy with the scent of damp earth and decay. Whispering voices pressed against my ears, promising release if only I would surrender. "Give in," they coaxed, soft and cruel. I sank to the floor, breath ragged, heart pounding against my ribs like a frantic prisoner. The dream entity, the whisperer, had crossed the veil. No longer confined to the realm of sleep, it stalked me in my waking hours, a malevolent presence feeding on my terror. But beneath the suffocating despair, a spark flickered. The knowledge that surrender meant the end not just for me, but for the town and its people. The nightmare would persist, fed by fear, until the prophecy was fulfilled. I was trapped between worlds, forced to confront a darkness older and more insidious than I had ever imagined. With trembling hands, I reached for my dream journal, the only tether to reality I had left. The words I had scrawled in desperation, fragments of whispered warnings and shadowed images, now pulsed with new meaning. There was a way to fight back. To cross into the dreamscape deliberately, to face the whisperer on its own ground. As the shadows thickened and the whispers grew louder, I steeled myself. The nightmare was no longer just a dream, it was my reality, and I would have to meet it head-on or be consumed entirely. The night stretched on, endless and merciless. Yet somewhere in the suffocating dark, a stubborn ember of hope remained, a fragile promise that even in the deepest shadows, the light could find a way through. I whispered back to the darkness, my voice shaking but resolute, "I will not let you win." And with that, I stepped further into the abyss, crossing the veil that separated dreams from waking life. Into a realm where fear was the only currency and survival was the darkest fight of all. The heavy door creaked shut behind me as Margaret Holloway led me into the dim sanctuary of her home. The air was thick with the scent of burning wood and old paper, a faint chill crawling beneath the skin despite the hearth's glow. Shadows danced on the peeling wallpaper, flickering like restless spirits, and the silence was punctuated only by the occasional crackle of the fire. I followed her slowly, my heart pounding with a mixture of anticipation and mounting dread. The weight of unspoken truths pressed down on us both. Margaret settled into a worn armchair, her fingers clutching the dark shawl wrapped tightly around her shoulders. Her eyes, sharp and unblinking, met mine with an intensity that sent a shiver through my spine. "You need to understand," she began, her voice low and trembling, "why this town suffers, why the nightmare clings to us like a second skin." I nodded, swallowing hard. "I'm listening," she exhaled slowly, gathering her thoughts as if each word cost her dearly. "Long ago, before the mountains swallowed the town whole, before the mist became a veil between worlds, there was a betrayal, a darkness that seeped into the very soil beneath our feet." Her gaze drifted toward the flickering flames, and for a moment, I could almost see the shadow she described taking shape in the firelight. "The whisperer," she whispered, "was born from pain, fear, and despair. It feeds on our collective terror, growing stronger with each nightmare." My breath caught. "But why me? Why now?" Margaret's expression softened, tinged with sorrow. "Because your arrival is no coincidence. The prophecy binds you to this place. The nightmare will persist until its price is paid, your death." A cold wave of disbelief washed over me. "There has to be another way." She shook her head slowly. "The cycle has repeated for generations, each new soul drawn here, each sacrifice carving the path for the next. We live under its shadow, trapped in a loop of fear and silence." The room seemed to close in, the weight of her words squeezing the breath from my lungs. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the window panes and carrying the faintest whisper of voices I could not place. The entity's presence was undeniable, a suffocating force pressing against the fragile walls of reality. Margaret reached for a small, hand-bound book resting on the table beside her. The leather was cracked and worn, the pages yellowed with age. She slid across to me, her eyes locking with mine. "This contains the prophecy, the history, and the truth. You must read it. You must understand the role you play." I hesitated, fingers trembling as I took the book. The firelight illuminated the faded script, each word carrying the weight of generations of pain and fear. My mind raced, questions tumbling like a storm. Was there truly no escape? Could I accept the burden placed upon me, or would I become just another lost soul swallowed by the nightmare? Margaret's voice cut through the silence, gentle but resolute. "You are not alone, there is hope, but it begins with acceptance." I looked up, meeting her steady gaze. The path ahead was shrouded in darkness, the whispers growing louder, but for the first time, I felt the sharp edge of purpose slice through my despair. The nightmare was a curse, yes, but within that curse lay the key to salvation if I dared to face it. As the shadows lengthened and the fire dwindled to embers, I opened the book, bracing myself for the truth that would change everything. The nightmare was no longer just a dream. It was my destiny, and the town's fragile hope rested on my shoulders. But as I read, a cold certainty settled in. The nightmare's end would come at a terrible cost. And the question remained, could I live with the price I was about to pay? Outside, the mist thickened, swirling like a living thing, hiding secrets, and waiting patiently for the next chapter to unfold. The fading light of day slipped beyond the jagged ridge of the mountains, casting the remote town into a creeping twilight that seemed to seep into every corner of my being. I sat on the creaking porch of the inn, the weathered wood cold beneath my hands, as the cool mountain air wrapped around me like a shroud. The scent of damp earth and pine needles drifted faintly on the breeze, but it was the whispers, the faint, almost imperceptible murmurings that unsettled me the most. They floated on the wind, carried from somewhere unseen, as if the nightmare had seeped beyond sleep and into the waking world itself. I pulled my jacket tighter, though it did little to stave off the chill that had settled deep in my bones. My eyes traced the outlines of the town below, dim streetlights flickering like dying stars against the encroaching dusk. The faces I had glimpsed earlier, etched with fear and resignation, haunted the shadows. Each one seemed to carry the weight of the nightmare, a shared burden that bound us all in silent torment. Inside, the dim glow of a single candle flickered through the window, the flame dancing in time with my racing thoughts. Margaret had come to me earlier, her presence both a comfort and a curse. Her sharp eyes, always watchful, had seen more than most, and the knowledge she bore was a heavy thing. Sitting across from me in the cramped-in parlor, she spoke with a voice low and steady, like the steady drip of water wearing away stone. "You carry the weight of this town," she said, her hands folded tightly in her lap beneath the dark shawl that had become her armor. "The prophecy is not kind, and it does not bend for anyone. You are bound to it as surely as the mountains hold the mist." Her words echoed in my mind, a grim melody that played over and over. The prophecy, an unyielding sentence whispered through generations, linking my arrival to the nightmare's rise and its inevitable end. The knowledge clawed at me, a merciless reminder that the nightmare would only cease when I died. The thought was a blade twisting in my gut, a cruel fate I was desperate to escape yet powerless to deny. I pulled out my dream journal, its worn pages cluttered with fragmented images and cryptic whispers. The scrawled notes reflected the chaos inside me: fear, confusion, and a desperate need for understanding. Each entry was a struggle to capture the shifting shadows of the nightmare, to wrest meaning from the endless darkness that invaded my sleep. Thunder rumbled in the distance, the first drops of rain tapping against the windowpane like a steady heartbeat. The storm outside was a tempest mirrored within, a battle raging between surrender and defiance. As the rain intensified, I pressed my hands against the cool glass, watching the droplets race downward, blurring the world beyond into a watercolor of grays and blues. My reflection stared back at me from the cracked mirror hanging crookedly on the wall, a pale, haggard face framed by unkempt dark hair, eyes rimmed with exhaustion and haunted by memories I could neither forget nor fully face. The whispers seemed to press in from every direction, merging with the shadows in the room until I could no longer tell where I ended and the nightmare began. Margaret's words echoed once more: "You must choose whether to give in or to fight. But know this, the fight will change you as much as it will change the town." The weight of fate settled heavily on my shoulders, the prophecy a merciless sentence that threatened to crush the fragile hope I clung to. Yet, beneath the despair, a flicker of something else stirred, a fragile resolve to confront the darkness, to wrest control from the shadows and fight for a future beyond the nightmare. But the question remained gnawing at the edges of my mind: could I find the strength to stand against a fate so absolute? Or was I doomed to become another whispered warning in this town's endless cycle of fear? As the storm raged outside, I sat alone with my thoughts, caught between the crushing weight of destiny and the flickering ember of resistance. The nightmare was far from over, and the dawn still seemed impossibly distant. But the choice lay before me, stark and unforgiving. To surrender was to die. To fight was to risk losing myself entirely. And somewhere, in that agonizing space between, my journey continued, shadowed by dread but driven by the faintest glimmer of hope. Night deepened, and with it, the whispers grew louder, as if the darkness itself awaited my next move. The nightmare had claimed much, but had not yet claimed my will. Not yet. The night had a different weight to it when Caleb Trent stepped out of the tavern. The familiar clink of glasses and murmured conversations replaced by a thick, oppressive silence. The cold gnawed deeper than usual, biting through the layers of his worn jacket. He lit a cigarette with shaking fingers, the flame briefly illuminating the harsh lines etched into his face. Smoke curled lazily upward, twisting and twisting, until it seemed to merge with the shadows gathering in the alley behind the tavern. Caleb had always been the skeptic, the man who refused to bow before legends and whispered curses. He had seen enough in his years as a police officer to know that fear could twist a town's mind, but this was something else. Something that gnawed on the edges of his sanity, a creeping dread he had fought to ignore. But tonight, the darkness seemed to have a voice, and it was calling his name. As he exhaled, A chill breeze swept through the alley, carrying with it a susurrus of whispers that made his skin crawl. The shadows on the cracked brick walls began to shift and pulse, coalescing into forms that danced at the edge of his vision. The whispers grew louder, a cacophony of voices murmuring secrets and accusations, dredging up memories Caleb had buried deep within himself, failures, regrets, losses. "You can't run from it," the voices hissed, a chorus of sorrow and menace. "You've lost more than you know." Caleb's heart thundered in his chest as the shadows stretched toward him, tendrils of darkness, reaching out like fingers. He tried to steady his breath, to ground himself in the tangible world, but the nightmare had crossed the threshold between sleep and waking. His knees buckled, and he sank to the cold ground, the cigarette dropping from trembling lips, its ember dying in the wet pavement. Far away in the small, dimly lit room he shared with the narrator at the inn, the door creaked open. The narrator stepped inside quietly, concern etched across his pale face. "Caleb," he called softly. Caleb's voice was a broken rasp. "It's real," he whispered. All of it, the nightmares, the whispers, the thing. The narrator sat beside him, the weight of Caleb's confession settling over them like a shroud. For so long, Caleb had been the anchor of rationality in the town, the voice of denial that kept despair at bay. Now, that anchor was lost, and the town's fragile unity trembled on the brink. "We have to fight," the narrator said firmly, placing a steady hand on Caleb's shoulder. Together, the following night, the mist rolled in thick and fast, swallowing the town in a ghostly embrace. Caleb stood at the center of the main street, the fog swirling at his feet as he faced the darkness head-on. His eyes burned with a desperate fire as he shouted into the void, his voice raw and unsteady.
"You will not have us!"
The shadows responded, twisting and rippling like a living thing. The whispering voice of the dream entity slithered through the air, mocking and cold. "Denial was your shield. Now your fear is your prison." Caleb's fists clenched, knuckles white in the gloom. "I'm not afraid anymore." A shudder passed through him, the oppressive presence pressing close, but he held his ground. The battle was no longer just for survival, it was for the soul of the town. After the confrontation, Caleb stumbled to the ancient stone well in the square, rain mingling with tears on his weathered face. The silence of the town pressed down like a tombstone, but beneath the despair flickered a fragile ember of hope. He was no longer alone in the nightmare. As dawn tinged the sky with pale light, Caleb and the narrator returned to the inn, the unspoken promise of alliance binding them. The nightmare was far from over, but with denial broken and fear confronted, the battle for the town's future had truly begun. And somewhere in the shadows, the whisperer watched and waited, its ancient hunger sharpened by this new defiance. The night was far from done, and the next whisper could be the last, or the beginning of a new nightmare. The night felt heavier than usual, pressing down on the town like a suffocating shroud. I sat in the dim common room of the inn, the faint glow of the fireplace casting long, flickering shadows against the worn wooden walls. My dream journal lay open before me, pages filled with fragmented whispers, cryptic sketches, and half-remembered images. Every line I traced seemed to pull me deeper into the nightmare's tangled web. The oppressive silence outside was broken only by the occasional creak of the old building settling, and the distant howl of wind threading through the mountain peaks. Ellen Royce entered quietly, her footsteps muffled against the threadbare rug. She moved with a practiced grace, a quiet presence that somehow felt like an anchor amid the storm raging inside me. Without a word, she set a steaming cup of herbal tea on the table, the scent of chamomile and mint momentarily cutting through the stifling atmosphere. Our eyes met briefly, and I saw in her gaze a mixture of sympathy and guarded knowledge she knew more than she let on. But fear had taught her silence. "You were pushing yourself too hard," Ellen said softly, her voice a gentle balm. "These dreams, they were not just nightmares, they were something else." I nodded, swallowing a lump of frustration. "I'm trying to find a pattern, some way to fight this." But every night it feels like the darkness grows thicker. She settled into the chair across from me, folding her hands in her lap. There's strength in knowing you're not alone. Tommy's been having the same dreams. The mention of Tommy stirred a flicker of hope I hadn't felt in weeks. Margaret's grandson, a child caught in the same nightmare web, represented something fragile yet fiercely alive. Ellen's voice lowered, careful and reverent. He's innocent, but the dreams weigh on him. We have to be careful, protect what little light he carries. Just then, a soft knock echoed from the inn's weathered door. Ellen's eyes sharpened, and I felt a jolt of tension pulse through the room. "That's probably Tommy," she said, rising cautiously. The door creaked open to reveal a small, pale figure shrouded in a threadbare coat. Tommy's wide eyes flicked nervously between Ellen and me. Clutched tightly in his trembling hands was a faded photograph, an old, sepia-toned image of the town's founders, their faces worn but hauntingly familiar. "I found this in my grandmother's things," Tommy whispered, voice barely audible over the crackling fire. "Maybe it can help us." I gestured for him to come inside, feeling the weight of his presence like a tether pulling me back from the edge. Together, in a shadowed corner of the inn, we pored over the photograph and the scraps of information we had gathered. Ellen shared stories she'd heard in hushed tones, fragments of a prophecy, whispers of an ancient curse binding the town and the nightmare to an inevitable fate. As we whispered urgently, the wind outside picked up, rattling the windows and sending shadows dancing across the walls. The dreamscape's presence felt suffocatingly close, as if the boundary between our waking world and the nightmare was thinning. We spoke of patterns in my dream journal, the symbols that repeated like a dark mantra, and the possibility that the prophecy might be broken if only we could find the key. Each revelation was a fragile thread of hope woven through the overwhelming dread. Our fragile alliance was a small beacon in the encroaching darkness, but even as we shared our fears and plans, an undercurrent of tension hung between us. Trust was tentative and the stakes impossibly high. Suddenly, another knock at the door startled us all. My heart hammered as I peered through the peephole, the cold night pressing against the glass. The figure on the other side was obscured by mist, and I couldn't tell if it was Salvation or another shadow from the nightmare come to snuff out our fragile hope. The chapter closes on this moment, suspended in breathless suspense, the alliance forged in darkness, now tested by the unknown that waits just beyond the door, and the terrifying question of whether we can survive the night ahead. The nightmare was far from over, but for the first time in a long while, I was not facing it alone. The night pressed close against the small room where I sat, the only light a flickering candle that cast unsteady shadows on the walls. Before me lay my dream journal, its pages dog-eared and stained from restless nights and hurried scribbles. Each entry was a fragment of the collective nightmare that gripped the town, a puzzle piece in a dark mosaic I was desperate to understand. I flipped through the pages again, eyes tracing the jagged handwriting, the words sometimes blurred, as if the ink itself were reluctant to stay put. Sketches of shadowy figures, cryptic phrases whispered in my dreams, and fragmented sentences like "the shadows shatter" when named teased me with their elusive meaning. I leaned in closer, the candlelight warming my pale face, and tried to steady my breathing. The whispers from the nightmare echoed faintly in my mind, but here, in the tangible world, I clung to the fragile thread of reason. Patterns began to emerge from the chaos, recurring symbols, repeated phrases, and a strange consistency in the dream's landscapes. It was as if the dream entity's influence followed a script, one that could be anticipated and perhaps disrupted. A soft knock at the door pulled me from my concentration. Ellen Royce stepped inside quietly, her eyes warm but shadowed with concern. She held out a leather-bound book, worn with age and care. "You might find this helpful," she said softly, placing it gently beside my journal. "It's a collection of old stories and fragments about the town's history and the nightmare." Some of it might shed light on what you were facing. Gratitude and unease mingled in my chest. Ellen, usually so reserved, seemed to understand the weight I carried. I opened the book, its pages yellowed but filled with faded ink and delicate sketches. The stories spoke of an ancient darkness, a curse rooted in a forgotten event that birthed the shared nightmare. More importantly, they hinted at ways the townsfolk had tried and failed to resist. Later that evening, as the sun dipped behind the mountains, Margaret Halloway approached me outside the inn. Her sharp eyes held a glint of sorrow and warning. "You've been digging too deep," she murmured, voice low and grave, "but there's one passage you must see." She handed me a folded piece of parchment, fragile with age but legible. Unfolding it, I read words that sent a chill down my spine. "The shadows shatter when named, but the price is steep. To speak the truth in the face of darkness invites the wrath of the whisperer. To defy fate is to dance on the edge of oblivion." Her gaze never wavered. "The dream entity feeds on fear and silence. If you can name it, confront it, you might weaken its hold. But be warned, the cost may be your very soul." That night, back in my room, the candle flickered as I lay in bed, the journal open on my chest. The whispered voices from the nightmare swirled around me, forming a sinister lullaby that challenged my resolve. Yet, armed with the fragments of knowledge gleaned from the journal and the town's lore, I felt a spark of defiance. The prophecy was no longer a sentence to fear, it was a challenge to meet head-on. I closed my eyes, willing myself to remember every detail, every clue. The shadows in my dreams would no longer remain nameless. I would face them, shatter them, and in doing so, carve a path through the darkness. But as the whispers faded into uneasy silence, I knew the journey ahead would demand everything I had: mind, body, and soul. The nightmare was far from over. In fact, it was only just beginning, and I was ready to fight. The room felt as if it were closing in on me, the thin walls bending under the weight of the oppressive darkness that had settled there. I was sprawled on the threadbare mattress, lungs struggling for air that seemed to thicken with every breath. The shadows on the ceiling twisted and writhed, forming faces that whispered my name in voices both distant and intimate. It was no longer just a dream. The nightmare had found a way to bleed into my waking life, and the whisperer's grip tightened with merciless precision. I pressed my palms against my temples, willing the cacophony of voices to cease. But the whispers only grew louder, transforming from sibilant murmurs into a maddening chorus that echoed the fears I had tried so hard to suppress. "You cannot escape," the voice hissed, layered with countless others, each one a fragment of the town's collective dread. My mind reeled, teetering on the edge of collapse. Visions flashed behind my eyelids, darkened streets, drenched in fog, the hollow eyes of townsfolk locked in eternal terror, and the twisting silhouette of the whisperer itself. It was a shifting mass of shadows impossible to pin down, yet unmistakably aware of my presence. I knew it fed on fear, and right now, it was consuming me whole. A sudden knock shattered the suffocating silence. Ellen Royce's silhouette appeared in the doorway, her eyes calm, yet filled with a quiet urgency. "You were pushing yourself too hard," she said softly, stepping inside with a lantern that cast a warm glow. "You have to hold on, we all do." Her voice was a fragile lifeline, a reminder that I was not alone in this. I wanted to believe her, to grasp at that tenuous thread of hope, but the darkness pressed harder, tightening its coils around my chest. That night, sleep was a battleground. The whisperer invaded my dreams with renewed ferocity, dragging me into an abyss where time dissolved and despair reigned. I found myself wandering through the town's empty streets, the fog thick and suffocating. Tommy Halloway appeared ahead, his small frame trembling. His wide eyes reflected the terror that gripped us all. As I reached out, the shadows surged forward, merging with his frightened face until the line between boy and nightmare blurred. The image seared into my mind, a stark reminder of what was at stake. This wasn't just about me. The nightmare threatened to consume an entire community, a lineage of pain and silence stretching back generations. I woke gasping, drenched in sweat, the echoes of the whisperer's voice still ringing in my ears. My body was weak, but something deep inside refused to yield. This was my breaking point, the moment when despair could either claim me or forge me anew. I settled back onto the mattress, fingers trembling as I opened my dream journal. The fragmented whispers, the cryptic symbols, and the fleeting clues, it was all there, waiting for me to decipher. I was no longer just a victim of this curse, but a participant in a struggle that demanded every ounce of my resolve. The night stretched on, endless and unforgiving, but as the first pale light of dawn crept through the window, I felt a spark of defiance flicker inside me. The whisper might have shattered my peace, but it had not broken me. Not yet. Tomorrow, I would face the nightmare again, not as a passive prisoner, but as a man determined to fight for a future beyond the shadows. And so, the battle continued, a delicate dance between hope and despair, with the fate of the town and my own soul hanging in the balance. I sat alone in Margaret's parlor, the ancient scroll sprawled across the rickety wooden table before me. The faded ink seemed to pulse beneath my gaze, each word a weight pressing down on my chest. Outside, the wind clawed at the skeletal branches of the trees, their brittle fingers scraping the window panes like desperate whispers from the darkness. Margaret watched me silently from her worn armchair, the shadows playing across her lined face. Her sharp eyes held a depth of sorrow and understanding I wasn't sure I was ready to confront. "You understand what this means," she said finally, her voice a brittle thread in the heavy silence. I swallowed hard, the taste of dust and despair thick in my mouth. The prophecy was clear: my death would end the nightmare that had gripped the town for generations. But surrendering to such a fate felt like a betrayal of everything I was fighting to hold on to, even if it meant prolonging this hell for everyone else. "There has to be another way," I whispered, though the words felt hollow even to my own ears. Margaret's gaze didn't waver. "I wish there was. But the whisper is patient and unyielding. It waits for the thread to snap, for the curse to be fulfilled." That night, in the suffocating stillness of my room, the dream entity came to me again. Its voice was a silk-wrapped razor, slithering into my mind with seductive ease. "Surrender," it hissed, "and the pain will cease." I shivered as a cold dread seeped into my bones, the entity's presence a suffocating shadow, just beyond the veil of sleep and waking. But beneath the fear stirred a stubborn ember of defiance. I wasn't ready to give in, not yet. Days passed in a blur of whispered dreams and waking nightmares. Margaret's quiet support grounded me, even as the town around us seemed to fray at the edges. One evening, beneath the frail glow of a dying lantern, I confessed my fears aloud. "I'm terrified," I said, voice cracking. "But I'm more afraid of what happens if I do nothing." Margaret nodded slowly. "Fear binds us all, but courage is the thread that can unravel it. The choice is yours to break the cycle or become another victim of it." When dawn finally crept through the mist, pale and uncertain, I stepped outside. The streets lay silent, the town holding its breath as if waiting for me to decide its fate. Every step felt heavy, laden with the knowledge that nothing would ever be the same after this day. I closed my eyes and took a deep breath, the chill air filling my lungs with fragile hope. The nightmare was mine to end or to live through. The choice was mine to make, and I would face it head on. I stood on the crest of the hill, the cold night air thick around me. A suffocating silence pressed against my ears, save for the faintest murmur of the wind through skeletal trees. The sky above was bruised and heavy, an oppressive twilight that seemed to seep into my bones. Below, the town lay quiet, cloaked in mist and shadow, as if holding its breath. I had made my choice, there was no turning back. Tonight, I would cross the threshold and plunge into the dreamscape not as a victim, but as a challenger. Closing my eyes, I let the darkness of the night mingle with the darkness within my mind, the boundary between reality and dream blurring with each slow, measured breath. The whispers began almost imperceptibly, curling around me like smoke, fragmented syllables that teased the edges of my consciousness. They spoke of endings and beginnings, of fate and surrender, their voices a sibilant chorus both alien and intimate. I willed myself deeper, feeling the world fold and twist, the solid hill beneath me dissolving into a shifting expanse of shadow and fog. When I opened my eyes, the landscape had transformed. The familiar contours of the town were warped beyond recognition, streets curled back on themselves, buildings stretched impossibly tall. Their windows like hollow eyes staring into oblivion. The air was thick, charged with a static energy that prickled my skin. Somewhere in the distance, a voice whispered low, serpentine, impossibly close yet maddeningly elusive. The whisperer. I called out, my voice cracking the silence. "I'm here, show yourself." A shiver rippled through the dreamscape, and the shadows coalesced, swirling into forms that defied logic, faces made of smoke, hands that melted into nothingness, eyes that glowed with abyssal light. The whisperer emerged not as a single shape but a living darkness, a presence that pressed against my mind with tendrils of despair and ancient malice. "You cannot escape," it hissed, its voice 1,000 voices layered into one. "Your death is the key. The cycle must be unbroken." I felt the weight of its words like chains tightening around my soul, memories and fears flooding my mind, the faces of the townsfolk, their haunted eyes, the endless nights of shared torment. But I steadied myself, drawing on the resolve that had carried me this far. "I'm not here to surrender," I said, voice steady despite the tremor in my chest. "Tell me your truth. Why bind this town to such suffering? Why me?" The whisperer laughed, a sound like cracking ice and brittle leaves. "The nightmare is born of fear, sustained by it. It feeds on your weakness, your dread. You outsider are the catalyst, the spark that ignited the curse. But beneath the torment lies a secret. To break the cycle, you must understand the root." Visions flooded me then, fragments of the town's past, twisted and broken, an ancient betrayal, a blood oath sealed in shadows. The birth of a darkness that clawed its way into the hearts of those who dwelled here. The whisperer was not merely a creature of nightmare, but a manifestation of the town's collective fear and guilt, bound by a prophecy that demanded a price. The dreamscape trembled as I grappled with the flood of knowledge, the oppressive shadows pressing closer, seeking to snuff out my light. But within that darkness, a fragile glimmer of hope flickered, a chance to sever the ties that bound us all. "I will not be your pawn," I declared, fighting the tendrils that sought to invade my mind. "If this curse is to end, I will face it on my terms." The whisper recoiled, a dark storm swirling wildly as it hissed, "You cannot win, mortal. The prophecy is absolute." But I'd tasted the truth, and in that knowledge lay power. The nightmare was no longer an unknowable terror, but a challenge I was determined to meet. As the dreamscape began to crack and fracture around us, I braced myself for the battle yet to come, a battle not just for survival, but for the soul of the town and my own fate. With a final, resolute breath, I stepped deeper into the shifting shadows, the fight for dawn beginning in the heart of darkness. The hilltop faded into a kaleidoscope of surreal images. Jagged shards of light fractured the dreamscape, casting erratic shadows that danced like phantoms. I moved cautiously, each step a test of my resolve as the ground beneath me warped and twisted unpredictably. The whisperer's voice echoed, sometimes close, sometimes distant, weaving a tapestry of menace that threatened to unravel my sanity. "You are but a thread in the tapestry," it whispered. "Your death will unravel all, but your struggle is futile." I clenched my fists, feeling the echo of past fears rise like a tide within me. Memories of loss, regret, and isolation surged, but I forced them down, replacing them with a fierce determination. This nightmare was not simply an external force, it was entwined with my own soul. Navigating the impossible geometry, I found myself before a swirling vortex of shadows, a gateway to the entity's core. The darkness pulsed with malevolent energy, whispering secrets of the town's darkest hour, a forgotten massacre, a pact sealed in blood. and the birth of the curse that ensnared us all. The Whisperer was the embodiment of all this pain and fear, feeding on the collective despair. I reached into my pocket and felt the worn pages of my dream journal, a talisman of my journey. Flipping to a page where I had scrawled a fragmented dream, I whispered, "Your hold ends here." The shadowy form surged forward, tendrils seeking to smother my mind, but I met them head-on, wielding my will as a shield. The battle was brutal. Whispered lies and visions of hopelessness assailed me, but each time I resisted, carving a path through the darkness. Then, in the midst of the chaos, a moment of clarity. The prophecy was not an unbreakable chain, but a challenge forged in fear and belief. If I could shatter the fear, the very foundation of the entity's power, the nightmare might dissolve. Summoning every ounce of strength, I confronted the Whisperer with a declaration of defiance, a beacon of light piercing the shadows. The dreamscape trembled, cracks spiderwebbing through the darkness, and the oppressive weight began to lift. But I knew this was only the beginning. The entity's power was vast, and my journey far from over. As the dreamscape quaked and the first hints of dawn threatened the horizon, I steeled myself for what was to come. The nightmare was unraveling, but at what cost? The dreamscape was a labyrinth of twisted corridors and shifting shadows. My breath came fast, each inhalation sharp with cold air that wasn't quite real. The Whisperer lingered just beyond sight, its presence a suffocating pressure that pressed against the edges of my mind. "You seek answers," it murmured, voice 1,000 echoes layered in one, both gentle and cruel. But answers come with pain. Pain was no stranger to me. I had carried it like a shadow for years, a constant companion. But this was different. This was the pain of a town's buried sin, a collective wound festering in darkness. I reached out, touching the shifting walls of the dreamscape, feeling the echoes of memories trapped within. Faces of the founding families flickered past, some twisted in agony, others serene in denial. The nightmare was born from their fear and betrayal, a curse woven into the fabric of this place. "Why me?" I demanded, voice firmer now. "Why must I bear this burden?" The Whisperer's form solidified momentarily, a silhouette of smoke and eyes that burned with ancient sorrow. "Because you carry the final thread, the spark of change. Without your end, there can be no beginning." The weight of inevitability pressed on me, but beneath it stirred a fragile ember of hope. If I could understand the nature of the curse, perhaps I could bend its terms. I stepped forward, embracing the darkness not as a victim, but as a seeker of truth. The battle for the town's soul had begun not with bloodshed, but with understanding. And in that understanding, perhaps salvation. As the dreamscape began to fracture, shards of light pierced the gloom, revealing glimpses of the town as it once was vibrant, alive, untainted by fear. The Whisperer recoiled, its form flickering like a flame in the wind. "You cannot undo what is done," it hissed. "Fear is eternal." I shook my head, stepping through the fragments of memory. Fear is a choice, and I choose to end this. The darkness writhed, struggling against the light I carried within. The nightmare was unraveling, but the battle was far from over. As I prepared to face the final trials, a cold certainty settled over me. The path ahead demanded sacrifice. Yet, in that sacrifice, there lay a chance for rebirth, not just for me, but for all of us. The dawn was close. I could feel it. And with it, the whisper of hope. The chill of the mountain air gnawed at my skin as I stepped out into the night, the mist curling around my ankles like the fingers of some unseen spectre. The town lay silent beneath a swollen sky, the moon a pale witness to the final act I was about to perform. Every breath I took seemed to thicken the darkness around me, whispers brushing past my ears, half-heard promises, and threats tangled in a language older than memory. I paused at the edge of the woods, the gnarled trees standing sentinel like ancient judges. The dream entity, the Whisperer, was waiting. I could feel its presence, a weight pressing on my chest, shadows shifting just beyond sight. It was no longer just a nightmare trapped in sleep. It had bled into the waking world, wrapping tendrils of dread around every corner, every heartbeat. Behind me, the faint glow of the inn's window marked a fragile beacon of warmth and humanity. Margaret's warning echoed in my mind. This path was one way. There would be no turning back once I crossed the threshold of the dreamscape. I clenched the worn leather-bound journal in my hand, the pages filled with fragmented whispers, sketches of shifting shadows, and desperate pleas carved in ink. Each entry told a part of the tale, the prophecy binding me to this cursed town, the nightmare's endless cycle, and the cruel price of its end. From deep within the woods, a low murmur rose like a tide, growing until it swelled into a chorus of voices, soft, insidious, and unrelenting. The whisperer had come to claim what was owed. "You cannot escape," it hissed, the voice like silk over broken glass. "Your death is the key. Your sacrifice, the only salvation." I swallowed the lump in my throat and stepped forward, the mist swirling around me like smoke. The darkness thickened, wrapping tight, and suddenly I was plunging into a void where time had no meaning, where shadows whispered secrets of ancient despair. The dreamscape welcomed me with cold arms. Shapes coalesced from the void, flickering forms that twisted and writhed, voices layering in a maddening symphony. And there, at the center, the whisperer loomed, a shape impossible to define, a shifting mass of shadows and whispers that seemed to pierce my very soul. "You came," the entity murmured, voice rippling like the surface of dark water. "You accept your fate." I met the void's gaze, feeling the weight of every soul trapped in this endless nightmare, every tear shed in fear, every silent scream swallowed by the night. "I do," I said, voice steady despite the tempest inside. "I will end this." A battle of wills erupted, a furious clash of light and shadow, hope and despair. The whisperer lashed out with visions of my past loss, regret, fear seeking to break my resolve. But I clung to the fragile ember of determination, the faces of the townsfolk, Margaret's steady eyes, Tommy's innocent hope. Time fractured, stretched, and finally shattered. I felt the nightmare's grip loosening, the entity's whispers fading to distant echoes. Then, a sudden stillness. The darkness peeled away like a veil, revealing a pale dawn breaking over the mountains. I was back, standing at the edge of the woods, breath-ragged but free. Behind me, the town stirred. Windows flickered with light, faces appeared at doorways, tentative, tear-streaked but waking. The nightmare's suffocating shadow lifted, replaced by a fragile peace. Margaret approached slowly, her eyes wide with a mixture of sorrow and gratitude. "It's over," she whispered, voice heavy with relief. "Because of you," I nodded, exhaustion washing over me like a tide. The cost was clear, my life the final currency to buy freedom for this haunted town. Yet in that sacrifice, a new beginning was born. As I sank to the ground, the last whispers of the entity dissolved like mist in morning light. The dream journal slipped from my grasp, pages fluttering open to the final entry. "The nightmare ends with me." And with that, silence fell deep and absolute. But even in that silence, I knew the echoes would linger, whispers waiting to rise again when the mist returned. The nightmare had ended, but the story was far from over. The cold darkness of the dreamscape had begun to fade, like ink dissolving in water. As I lay on the unforgiving ground beneath a sky that was neither day nor night, but something in between. My breaths came shallow and ragged, each one a fragile thread tethering me to the waking world I had fought so desperately to preserve. Around me, the shadows, the whisperer's tendrils thinned and broke apart, dissipating into nothingness, as if the very act of my surrender had shattered its hold. I could feel the weight of its presence lifting, the oppressive dread that had clung to every breath in the town, finally giving way to silence. I tried to move, to rise, but exhaustion pressed me down with the force of years' worth of torment. And yet beneath the fatigue, a strange peace hummed through my veins. The nightmare was ending, the prophecy was fulfilled. I had become the final key, the sacrifice required to vanquish the ancient evil that had plagued this town since its dark beginning. Back in the town, dawn crept slowly over the jagged mountain peaks, painting the mist in hues of soft gold and lavender. Margaret stood alone at the edge of the main square, her sharp silver eyes scanning the streets as the first light touched the weathered buildings. Her dark shawl fluttered lightly in the morning breeze, a banner of both mourning and cautious hope. Around her, the townsfolk began to stir, not with the usual hollow, haunted eyes, but with a tentative clarity that made her throat tighten. For the first time in decades, they awoke free from the nightmare's suffocating grasp. Inside the inn, the warmth of the hearth cast dancing shadows across the walls as Ellen quietly approached the room where I rested. Her gentle footsteps barely disturbed the silence, yet her presence felt like a balm to my weary soul. She set a cup of tea on the bedside table, the steam curling upward in a delicate spiral that seemed almost sacred. Our eyes met, and in that silent exchange, I found a wellspring of unspoken gratitude and respect. Her kindness was a fragile thread connecting me back to the world I had almost lost. Later, as the streets emptied of their usual dread, Tommy's small hand slipped into mine. The boy's wide, innocent eyes held no trace of the fear that had once shadowed his every glance. Instead, they shone with a fragile light that felt like the dawn itself, a symbol of renewal and the promise that the nightmare's hold was finally broken. Together, we walked the silent streets, the town slowly awakening around us, fragile but free. The price had been high. My own fate was sealed by the choice I had made, and though the whisperer's voice was gone, its echo lingered, a whisper on the edge of memory, a cautionary tale woven into the fabric of this place. The town was changed forever, scarred but unshackled from the dark cycle that had bound us all. As the sun climbed higher, casting long shadows behind us, I understood that this was not an end, but a beginning. The nightmare had ceased, but the story, the legacy, would live on. A whispered warning to those who might one day wander into these mountains seeking peace, only to find the echoes beyond the mist. And somewhere deep inside, beneath the weariness and sorrow, a small ember of hope kindled, fragile yet unyielding, waiting to be nurtured into light. But even as the town breathed its first free breaths in generations, I could not shake the feeling that the silence was not absolute, that somewhere, beyond the veil of waking life, the last whisper still lingered, waiting for the next cycle to begin. Dawn crept slowly over the mist-draped peaks that cradled the town, casting long, pale fingers of light across the sleeping rooftops. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, the oppressive weight that had suffocated the town's soul began to lift, as if the air itself exhaled a silent breath of release. The nightmare that had bound every heart, every mind in its inescapable clutch, faded like a receding tide, leaving behind a fragile calm. In the quiet streets, doors opened hesitantly, faces emerged from shadowed rooms, and the townsfolk blinked against the unfamiliar brightness. Their eyes, once dulled by shared terror, now reflected a cautious hope, mingled with the unmistakable residue of exhaustion and pain. Whispers fluttered through the morning air, tentative threads weaving the community back together after their collective ordeal. The nightmare had ended, but its echoes lingered, soft and persistent, like the last notes of a mournful song. Margaret Halloway stood near the town square, her gaze steady and sharp beneath the silver strands of hair pulled taut at the nape of her neck. The dark shawl wrapped tightly around her shoulders seemed heavier today, as if carrying the weight of 1,000 unspoken sorrows. She looked out over the gathering townsfolk, their faces a mosaic of relief, grief, and uncertainty. The space beside her remained empty, the place where the narrator once sat, now a silent testament to the price paid. "He saved us," a voice murmured from the crowd, trembling yet resolute. Others nodded, their eyes misting with tears. The narrator's sacrifice had shattered the nightmare's hold, but at a cost that none could fully comprehend. In the hush that followed, the town seemed to hold its breath, honoring a man who had come seeking peace and had instead become their reluctant savior. Caleb Trent stood apart, his usual rugged defiance softened by the weight of recent events. The cigarette he had carried so often was now crushed beneath his boot, its smoke replaced by a silence heavier than any words he could muster. Beside him, Ellen Royce watched the crowd with a quiet kindness, her observant eyes catching the smallest shifts in mood and spirit. For a moment, their gazes met, an unspoken understanding passing between them, a fragile truce forged in shared suffering. "Never thought we'd see the dawn like this," Caleb said quietly, voice rough but sincere. Ellen nodded, her smile faint but genuine. "Neither did I, but here we are." The town began to stir with tentative life. Children's laughter pierced the morning air, fragile and bright, as Tommy Halloway darted through the streets. His wide eyes sparkled with a pure innocence untainted by the nightmare shadow. Watching him, the townsfolk felt a rekindling of something they had feared lost forever: hope. Yet beneath the surface of this newfound peace, a silent tension remained. The nightmare had ended, yes, but the memory of its horrors, and the narrator's grim fate, would linger like a whispered warning passed down through generations. The town had awakened from its shared terror, but the scars etched into its soul would shape its future. A constant reminder of what had been endured and what might one day return. As the sun climbed higher, casting warmth over the mist, a gentle breeze stirred the leaves of the ancient trees encircling the town. The whispers that had once brought dread now seemed to carry a different message, one of remembrance, resilience, and the unyielding strength found in unity. Margaret's voice broke the silence, steady and clear. "We remember. We carry the past, but we live for the future." In that moment, the town breathed as one, a fragile but unbroken heartbeat echoing through the mountains. And though the narrator was gone, his presence remained a shadow in the light, a whisper in the wind, a guardian watching over the dawn of a new day. The nightmare was over, but the story, the warning, the legacy, it was far from finished. Outside the edges of the town, where the mist still curled like restless spirits, new figures appeared on the horizon. Travelers drawn by the whispered tales, the lingering shadows that promised both danger and revelation. The cycle was poised to begin anew, but the town stood ready, forever changed, forever vigilant. And so the whispers continued, carried on the morning breeze, as the sun rose higher and the town awakened to its fragile freedom. The morning sun struggled to pierce the thick mist that clung stubbornly to the town's narrow streets, casting a pale, ghostly light over the buildings still damp with dew. It was a dawn unlike any other, heavy with the weight of silence and a fragile promise. The nightmare that had gripped the town for so long, the endless darkness filled with whispers and impending doom, had finally been broken. Yet as I stepped out onto the cracked pavement, the air still seemed charged with a whispering undercurrent, faint but persistent, like the memory of a cold breath against the back of your neck. Margaret Halloway was already waiting by the old stone fountain in the town square, her sharp eyes scanning the horizon where the mountains met the sky, still cloaked in mist. Her silver hair was pulled back tightly, a dark shawl wrapped protectively around her frail shoulders. She nodded as I approached, a gesture heavy with unspoken understanding. The town was waking from its shared nightmare, but the scars it left were far from healed. Inside the dimly lit inn, Ellen Royce moved quietly among the sparse mourning patrons, her presence a steadying force amid the remnants of fear. She slipped a small, worn notebook across the counter to Margaret when no one was looking, a dream journal, its pages filled with fragmented whispers and shadowy sketches. It was a testament to the horrors we had faced, a record of the collective terror that had bound us all. Margaret accepted it with a somber nod, her fingers brushing the cover lightly, as if afraid to disturb the fragile peace it represented. Outside, Tommy Halloway played near the fountain, his innocent laughter a rare and precious sound in a town long muted by dread. His wide eyes held a tentative hope, a reminder of what had been gained and what was still at risk. Watching him, I felt the weight of my sacrifice settle deeper into my bones. The end of the nightmare had come at a terrible cost. Yet it was that very cost that might save this place. Caleb Trent stood nearby, a cigarette smoldering between his fingers, the lines of skepticism softened by recent revelations. His eyes, once clouded with denial, now held a wary acknowledgement of the forces we had battled. Together, Margaret and Caleb exchanged a glance that spoke of resilience and a guarded determination to protect the fragile peace we had wrested from the darkness. But as the mist shifted and the town stirred to life, a new figure appeared on the outskirts, a stranger, hesitating at the threshold of the mountains and the unknown. The faintest whispering breeze tangled through the trees, brushing against the newcomer's skin like a warning from the shadows. The cycle was not over. The echoes of the nightmare lingered, waiting patiently for the next chapter to unfold. I watched from the square, the weight of what had been and what might come pressing down on me. The town was free, but freedom came with vigilance. The nightmare had ended, but its whispers, soft, insistent, and eternal, remained. They were the echoes beyond the mist, a reminder that some darkness never truly fades, only sleeps. The sun climbed higher, burning away the last tendrils of fog, but in the depths of the town's soul, the whispers waited, ready to awaken again. And in that waiting lay the promise of fear, of prophecy, and of dreams yet to be dreamed. The story was over for now, but the echoes beyond the mist would never be silent. As I turned away from the square, the cold wind carried a single whispered word, barely audible yet unmistakably clear: begin.